Hey everybody, this is Ruger Aber. I am the creator and director of Mexisol Retreats, and I'm here with Jamie Metz, who does the integration. And today we're going to be talking about 6 integration techniques that help you connect with your higher self before or after an ayahuasca retreat. So first, let's introduce the concept of the higher self, and we'll go from there.
Okay, so I've been doing integration at Mexisol for about 7 months, and I always mention the higher self always, but we don't have a lot of time to develop the concept. So in this video, we're going to work at developing the concept of the higher self. The higher self the concept has been around for thousands of years. Mystics use it, religions use it. My advanced education is in transpersonal psychology. It's the basis of transpersonal psychology. It's also used in different types of therapy. The idea that every human has a higher self. It's important in plant medicine because we connect with that often. I mean, don't you think so, Ruger, that we often connect or we have a glimpse of the higher self when we take plant medicine?
Yeah, I think that's a big thing of what ayahuasca does. At least in my experience, I didn't really even realize that a higher self existed until I did ayahuasca for the first time.
Yeah. And it's a little bit of an elusive concept, but when you've done ayahuasca, then you're like, oh, I get it, right? So a couple of things happens. When I'm following people in the integration process after they go home, a lot of them say, oh, I want that feeling. I want that connection that I had when I was at Mexisol and at La Finca and on medicine. And they crave that. And they say, how can I get that? So this discussion can help with that. But also, once you've taken plant medicine, you can see a lot of things about yourself. And once in a while, everything comes together, and that's great, and you get it. But for most of us, we need to work on now letting go of the things that we understand or developing parts of us that we know we now need to develop after doing plant medicine. So the other thing about the higher self is that it gives us a tool to do the work, after coming home from doing plant medicine. So the higher self basically, if you can imagine, you have we all have lots of thoughts going on in our head most of the time. We wake up, we load our thoughts, they're going all day. We go to bed, we get a little break from our thoughts. We wake up the next morning and we have all these thoughts going on. A lot of people don't realize that they're not those thoughts. In fact, a lot of people don't even notice their thoughts. So the higher self is the ability to notice thoughts that you're having, and the thoughts can be contradictory. It can be quite complicated. But if you just think of all the different voices going on in your head, telling you different things, developing stories, solving problems, the busyness of your mind, that is often associated with the ego. And the ego is beautiful and wonderful. After you do plant medicine, some of the ego isn't needed anymore. Some of it develops better. It adjusts itself. But we never want to get rid of the ego because that's a really important part of being a human being. So when we think about the higher self, it is all these thoughts, which are not the higher self. That's one self, or the lower self. And then the higher self is the ability to view those thoughts and to realize we're not those thoughts, that we're something else, we're something bigger, we're something more conscious. And the higher self is that ability to stand back and observe our thoughts so that we can work with them. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I think it'll make more sense when we go into the first topic we're going to discuss, which is the narrative self.
Right. Okay. So the narrative self, and that term is largely used by a social psychologist, and his name is Jeffrey Martin. I really like it because he basically is saying that all of his research in consciousness and awareness and people who are really genuinely at peace with themselves, they develop this awareness of their thoughts. And that those thoughts become a narrative. We wake up in the morning and say, oh my gosh, I've got to go to work. Oh my gosh, I'm late. I think I should eat that for breakfast. No, maybe I should eat that for breakfast. I think my boss thinks this, or I think my client thinks this. And then we go to work. And so it's all this narrative or storytelling that goes on all during the day in our mind. And that's the narrative. And so when or the narrative self, the storytelling that goes on during the day. So if we think again about this higher self, we have storytelling, probably problem solving that really isn't problems that need to be solved. It's just this busyness of the mind. And so when we can notice those happening, and the higher self is up here like, yep, we notice that. The narrative self is that busyness of the stories that the mind tells. So really, if you think about stories, because the narrative self is very closely associated with stories, if we notice the stories we tell are just stories. No story is actually true, by the way. I mean, that we could take a little bit of time, probably don't have it in this video, but to really realize that every story is just one person's perspective. And even they have just filtered through some details in order to come up with a story that's somehow useful to them. And so when we talk about their narrative self, it's about all those stories that are going on in our mind that tells us who we are, what we think, who we think other people are. And most of those things just are not accurate.
Well, and that's something wild to me too that I never really realized. I just had this concept of myself, and for years and years and years, it was negative, and it simply wasn't true. It was just these things you tell yourself over and over and over. And some of the ways now that I've identified it is if you start, well, one is if you have resistance to something, then it's very easy to start creating stories. And even something like this is the first video we're doing, and I had a lot of resistance to doing it. It came from excuses like, okay, like we need to have it at this time and we need to have this set up. And if you notice, I don't have anything in my walls. And that was a reason. That was one of the things. I was like, okay, well, I have to have this nice background and I have to do this and it has to have this before. And it was just like, because there's something there. And I'm just telling myself a story.
Yeah. Yeah. So just think about, we tell ourselves stories, and then we can kind of get upset with ourselves because then we think, well, that's just a story and we're just telling it. So you could be upset with yourself for telling your stories. But one reason that the ego is important is because the ego is really just trying to protect you. Well, what if you do these videos and it fails? What if you look silly? What if people don't respect you? What if it doesn't work and you put a lot of time into it, right? So the narrative self tells you those stories to try to protect you from being vulnerable.
Well, another way that I think is really good to identify when you're telling us stories is if you start using the words need or should. I'm 40 years old. I need.
So just think about, we tell ourselves stories, and then we can kind of get upset with ourselves because then we think, well, that's just a story and we're just telling it. So you could be upset with yourself for telling your stories. But one reason that the ego is important is because the ego is really just trying to protect you. Well, what if you do these videos and it fails? What if you look silly? What if people don't respect you? What if it doesn't work and you put a lot of time into it, right? So the narrative self tells you those stories to try to protect you from being vulnerable.
Well, another way that I think is really good to identify when you're telling us stories is if you start using the words need or should. I'm 40 years old. I need this. I should be doing this. When you start using those words repeatedly, that's a really good chance that you're telling yourself a story that is not accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. At La Finca, when I've been there with you at Mexis, so a lot of times I'll tell a story a bit about you and I. And I do that because I tell my version of the story, and then you always say, well, that's not true, Jamie. It's really is like this, right? And it gives you an example of like the participants gives them example that stories just aren't true. And I filter out of the story what's useful to me. You filter what's useful to you. And so that's how sometimes we use stories, but also then like what you're saying is we create the pieces of the story that like pull us back and protect us. Like, oh, like even like now, when it's time to go to Mexisol and do integration, I think, oh, I'm too old for that. Or It just wears me out, or maybe I'm not qualified, and really that's just my ego trying to protect me. But think about this, if we can realize we're not stories, stories are entertaining, they're fun, they're useful as long as they don't do any damage sometimes. But if we can remember we're not stories, then think what the possibilities are when we step out of whatever narrative we've given ourselves. The possibilities for our own lives are huge.
Really, you can be whoever you want at any time. And that's like, there's a little bit of some fear and some scariness of if something's not true. But what you do at the beginning is if something's not true, then everything's not true.
Mm-hmm.
But if you really approach it as oh, this isn't true, so I adapted and I changed and I learned something, and then if you get good at this practice of identifying what's a story, then really you have a lot of potential to change or do or be whoever you want at any given moment.
Yeah. So you can think nothing's true, or you can also say, whatever I choose to be true can pretty much be true. And so, like, okay, I'm Jamie and I'm a grandma and I'm a wife and I have a private practice and I can define myself. But that's kind of a trap too. Like, what are all the other possibilities I could be if I could see outside of my narrative? But it is actually difficult to find those pieces outside of how we've defined ourselves. And that again is why we want to develop that relationship with the higher self, because the higher self isn't attached to our personality. It's not attached to our achievements. It's not attached to our stories at all. As we develop that relationship with this higher self, then we can say, oh, I see some more possibilities.
I think that's a good segue into the second topic, which is that everybody and you are perfect. This is something that really it's the foundation and it's the core, I think, of what we do. It requires the most work, but that's kind of what this work is. And at some point, we'll probably do an entire video series on this, maybe more than one. But this entire concept of that you are not broken, you don't need to be fixed, that you are perfect just the way you are. And I think so that bears some explanation. But basically, we have two parts of ourselves. We have this part that we accept, and this part that we don't accept. And a lot of the parts we don't accept comes from the childhood, and it typically comes from childhood trauma. And so what I want to explain with trauma is it's the way you perceive things in your mental state at the time. The example I've thought of before is just as a child, you're loud in a restaurant and your parents need to say something to you to get you to behave in a restaurant. And it's probably in the moment they're saying something, and the way you perceive it, the story you tell yourself from the child carries with you to when you're an adult. And so maybe they were assertive or aggressive with the way they said it, maybe not. Could be just the story. But then your brain in that undeveloped state as a child, it can perceive that as, very aggressive. It can perceive it as something as traumatic because you are now taking a part of yourself that is innocence of a child and you're suppressing it. And what happens as a child, if you feel that you can't act that way, you can feel that your parents won't love you. And if your parents don't love you, you'll be abandoned and you'll die. And really those tiny little things that are unique to all of us, those can be very traumatic. And those are a lot of the things we need to work through.
And almost everyone has those, even if they don't realize it. I went into I wanted to work in the world of mindfulness, consciousness, and being really a thinking partner, right? So I didn't really want to go into therapy, but what I've discovered it with clients is that every person has some childhood stuff that they interpreted a certain way, and it still affects how they think. It still affects how they see themselves. And so what you're talking about is really important. But the higher self knows you're not broken. The higher self knows we're just here having this great experience, and these pieces that you make wrong and you make right, it actually, every human being has to separate these pieces initially. And what we're doing with this developing relationship with our higher self or doing consciousness work is we're bringing those pieces back together. We're integrating those pieces. And one reason, and I know this is a short video, so I won't go into it very in very much depth, but what happens is, you're born whole, but you're born into a culture, and every culture has different values. They have different things that they want and things they don't want. And your parents' responsibility is to get you to conform to a culture. So in our culture, children should behave nicely in restaurants. They can't be loud. In some cultures, kids can be as loud as they want, no problem. But what your parents are trying to do is they're trying to make you culturally aware and accepting. And they're saying, okay, this is good, this is bad, this is good, this is bad. And depending on the skill of the parent and doing that like gently, softly, age appropriately, it does a less of that kind of those micro traumas that we get, or what you're talking about is trauma or difficulties and maybe processing later because you have a belief that just isn't true. But anyway, so some of this work when you're developing your relationship with your higher self is bringing together the parts that we said, oh, this isn't good, this is good. It's not true. We're just a human being having a beautiful human experience.
Well, I think there's a little bit more to explain with that I can try. Is it's not the fact that when I say everything's perfect, it's not like, oh, well, I don't need to do anything because I'm perfect. It's the fact that it's more of this acceptance and coming from this idea that I don't need to improve. I don't need to be better. I don't need to be good enough. I am good enough already. I need to accept those parts and realize they're perfect and kind of, experience them and then let them go. And then, for example, if you have an anger issues, that probably comes from something from childhood where you're fear-based.
No, yeah. Anger is always fear-based. Yeah. Yeah.
And so with anger, I mean, it's like, if you want to modify that, usually it's to look at what makes you angry in the first place, find that, accept it, realize that part is perfect, and also realize too, it might depend on how you're raised. Anger for you might be a completely normal response. You can change it. You can eventually modify that, but to just realize that, acknowledge it, and then accept it.
Yeah. Yeah. And then maybe, choose something different because there's probably something better than anger, that could be used. One of the things I think is interesting about this point of that we're not broken is that my background is in transpersonal psychology. I'm academically trained. And then Umberto, our shaman, is a shaman, right? Shipibo trained in Peru. But we both, the foundational piece of our work is that humans are not broken. So it's interesting that this is foundational to the work you're doing at Mexisol, and I'm doing with my clients, and Umberto's doing with all the people he's working with all over the world.
Yeah, so our third topic is detachment and reframing. I think the best way that I can kind of explain this is with a personal example. So I had needed a company that was going to help me redesign the website. And so I used a place, and they were based out of California, and they're very much into the corporate world. And it was incredibly frustrating at times to work with them because their approach to things was just very corporate, very commercial. And for me to try to get them to kind of see things the way I wanted them to be seen, there was just this communication barrier. And there was quite a bit of frustration with that. And sometimes there's even like this, I can feel like kind of the emotional response. And then you start telling stories. You start seeing maybe they don't know what they're doing, or you start just developing all these kind of stories around the people to make them wrong and you right. And then what I decided to do one day is I'm just like, I wonder what it's like from their end. right now you have they probably perceive as you got this guy who doesn't know what he wants, doing a bunch of drugs in Mexico, and then trying to like have it done his way. And it's just like this ridiculous situation.
Yeah, yeah,
And if you, and that's just a way to like reframe things. I reframe things with humor all the time. And if I can feel, so if I can, you can usually feel uh, what I would call like a trigger of this emotional response to something. If you can kind of feel that, if you can even just detach yourself, that's why detaching and reframing go hand in hand. When you can kind of feel that response, if you're able to just detach and become the observer of where of that emotion, you're able to kind of detach from that emotion and then reframe it in a different way of how you normally respond to it.
yeah. I like that. I mean, your story has a lot of humor because you can imagine corporate guys in California wanting to, trying to understand you and doing the best, trying to be professional and really like, what's going on? It's crazy to think about. You can't guess what's going on in somebody's mind. You never can. But it's kind of fun to think, well, they might be thinking this, and like, and so this is actually quite humorous. One of the things when we talk about detaching is in every situation that you're in, there's usually a stimulus and there's a response, a stimulus and a response. So if you get a stimulus and you respond by being frustrated, like they have another question about the website, I'm frustrated. So that's a stimulus or response, right? But if you can catch yourself, there's a little moment, a little gap in time where you can have a different choice than your normal response. And that's your place to reframe. That's your point. It's like, oh, well, maybe instead of being frustrated, I could choose humor. I could find this interesting. I could look at it from their point of view. There's lots of different choices you could have done with your response if you can catch that moment to reframe that little tiny gap in time where you can change the response you would normally have.
Yeah, it's really powerful. I mean, another example that I'll give is I'm learning Spanish at the moment. And so for all of last weekend, I was walking around a park and trying to engage in somewhat of a conversation with people. And what would happen is a conversation would kind of start and they'd kind of know what I was saying. And then they would speak to me and then I'd have no idea what they're saying. So it was frustrating because I took this time and I'm still doing it, but I'm learning to speak Spanish. And again, like you can sit in that frustration, or I kind of realized like one, I made a joke of it because I told people later I'm getting really good at just confusing the shit out of local people. And the other thing is just like, I wonder what it's like from their perspective. You got this guy that comes up to them and starts this conversation, and probably the beginning of the sentence is decent Spanish because I know exactly what I'm going to say and I've kind of like rehearsed it. And so then they talk back to me in pretty fluent Spanish, and then that's like, okay, I don't know. So I mean, if you kind of add some humor to it, and also just the detachment to put yourself in somebody else's position, I think that's really powerful.
It's very powerful. You could be like, oh, I'm not good enough. The Spanish is too hard, blah, blah, blah. Or you could say, well, this is fun. I'm going to practicing in the park and I'm getting to see these people and this is a whole new experience. And so you get to choose which way you get to go depending on how you frame the situation.
Do you have anything else to add on that?
Well, one thing is like I was talking about there's a stimulus and response, you have a little gap time where you can make a different choice, right? There's also things you can look at like patterns. Like I have a pattern of, for instance, I was noticing that a certain type of personality always bothered me. And the people I go about the world, I love the world, I love people, I love humanity. And then I would get this hiccup like, oh, I don't really like that person. And then I noticed there was a pattern between the people I didn't like. And really what it was I had a belief system about, it was about men that behave a certain way. And then I just automatically make them wrong, right? And so once you see a pattern, once I saw the pattern, I could go inside myself and say, okay, what's here for me? How do I need to reframe what I'm seeing here? Because certainly these people are just humans having a human experience, and they're lovely. I have a trigger inside of me. And so I've been working on reframing how I see certain personality types, because it really is just my judgment, something from childhood that I picked up that I'm just working on. So that you can, once you see patterns, that's when you can start saying, okay, I think I need a reframe here.
I think one way to see the pattern too is if, as you, to your point, if you keep having an emotional reaction to a certain thing or a certain person or personality type, or there's something there. There's something there that can give you an opportunity to kind of dig deeper and do a little bit of work on where that is coming from. And then even just knowing that can help you detach from a certain emotional response.
Yeah. And everything that's happening to us has value. Everything that's happening. And so we think, well, this is good, or this is bad, this is right, this is wrong. No, I mean, we're just putting values on something. But if we can remember everything that's happening, like when I'm working with clients, you know what I work with? I don't have any protocol. I don't say this is, we're going to learn A, B, C, D. I always work with what's happening in their lives, because whatever's happening in their life, that's their work. And so for anybody listening to that video, this video, that's the work, is what's happening in your life. That's where your work is. And that's where you're working on this detachment reframing. Whatever's happening in my life, I'm working with detachment and reframing always by my emotional response. If I'm angry, if I'm jealous, if I'm resentful, if I'm sad, then those are opportunities for me to work on looking at my belief system and reframing it.
And I think the next thing we're going to talk about, meditation, is a really good way to be able to recognize or develop that gap.
Yeah. So if all the tools you could use in developing consciousness, awareness, mindfulness, awakeness, whatever you want to call it, meditation is my favorite. Absolutely, even above, hate to say this, Ruger, even above plant medicine. Meditation is the place that it's available to you anytime. And once you start meditation, you used to your brain's used to doing it. It actually changes the physical makeup of your brain. And so what a lot of times what I'll do with meditation is, once I get in that meditative state, it's really, well, if you don't know, meditative state is I get there with my breath. And then when there's this kind of this vague boundaries between me and the world, or like I'm kind of between awake and asleep, but there's this vague boundaries there. And this, now I'm working in this, I'm lucid, I'm thinking about, not even thinking, I'm just observing. Remember this, I'm observing my thoughts. A lot of them just kind of fade away. And I'll notice which thoughts remain, which ones stay. And instead of trying to get rid of them, that's not what I'm trying to do, I'm noticing like, oh, why are those thoughts persistent? Why do they just like cling and hang on? And then I can notice where I'm holding energy in my body. Maybe I'm holding resentment, or maybe I'm holding some anger, or maybe I'm holding some not good enough, which is pretty common. And then in that place of meditation, I can work on dissolving those feelings. And in that, the process of dissolving them, I can see what got them there. And I'm able to look at my belief system around that. It's not as solid as what it sounds like, because it's this place of work and meditation is a vague space, but it's very powerful for me, because I'll actually meditate up to 2 hours a day if I can find the time, because It's a way to just to clean up anything that's going on and notice what I'm hanging on to. And also, this video is about the higher self. It's one of the best ways I know to have that relationship with this higher self, that's not judgmental, that sees everything as perfect. And then it's like, okay, so if everything is perfect, then what do you want to work on today, Jamie? What is important to you? What are you hanging on to? And there's no judgment in that place. I love meditation.
When I first started doing meditation, I didn't even realize that. I just thought it was a nice kind of way to take time for yourself and relax, which it is. It is. But I think one of the biggest assets that I've gained from it is it really does kind of put your mind into practice of the things we've talked about, of kind of this connection with the higher self. Because when you're in that presentness, there's not really the past and there's not really the future. And I think that's as close as you can get to just being this state of awareness where you really are connected to your higher self. And then the other thing that really helps with the practice is the difficult part of meditation is when you keep having the thoughts come in. So you're able to recognize them and appreciate them and observe them and then kind of detach from them.
Yeah. And there's no, and meditation, which is interesting, as you say that is there's no stories in meditation, because if you're in stories, you're not in meditation. And so you're just there with that thought or that feeling, but there's not really this story, like this connects to this and blah, 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 blah. And so it's a place also to be outside of story, which is pretty powerful.
Yeah, so the fifth topic we're going to bring up is gratitude. I feel like gratitude is one of the simplest things that anyone can do. Umberto says during the retreats that gratitude is the key to everything, and I really do believe that. It's something that you can do even if you do not feel grateful at all. Because even if you don't feel like it, you still know there's a few things you're grateful for. And so something that I really recommend for anyone new, or anyone, is just the practice of what I would do is write down 3 things in the morning that you're grateful for and 3 highlights of your day at the end of the day. And if you do that, it will change. It'll really just change your life.
Will change your life. Absolutely. Because it changes how your brain functions. If you wake up and write down 3 things, your brain is forced to think of 3 things that it's grateful for. Otherwise, the brain's going to be doing something else that it would rather do, but bring it back to gratitude. And now your brain is now functioning different. And then at night, things that have gone well in the day, instead of like, oh, la, 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 this didn't go good, that didn't go good, your brain is forced to come back to find those things. And so now you're asking your brain to work differently. What I do with clients is I ask them at the beginning of every session, like, let's start with celebrations. And they'll say, well, what kind of celebrations? It's almost like resistance. Like, well, what kind of celebrations? Like, any kind of celebrations, like anything from the last time we met, anything going on with your family, your friends, anything that you're happy about, just anything. I don't care. It doesn't have to do with anything to do with what we're doing with the work and the coaching work that I'm doing with that client. Because really what I'm asking them to do is to use their brain to go back and collect things that went well, or that they're happy about, that they like in their lives. And there's a huge variety of what they come up with, but now their brain is working different. And once we've started with that, then the whole rest of the session goes differently and more positively, more possibilities. They see problems different. It's really quite remarkable doing a coaching session with somebody who, with just starting with celebrations with a person versus going right into the nuts and bolts of something that's hard. It's quite fascinating for me to watch, actually.
I imagine that's something that the people at the beginning don't even realize why you're doing it or what you're doing it for. But I'm sure that's something that if you did 3 people without it and then 3 people with it, it would make a huge difference.
Huge difference, huge. And they get to where they like it. So they start and there's a resistance to it. They don't want to use their time. Their brain doesn't want to go there. Their brain wants to focus on what it's worried about. But then what'll happen is that clients, because a lot of my clients, I always work with a minimum of 4 months. And by 4 months, they can tell a difference. But there's clients I've worked with for over 10 years, and they come already prepared to do their celebrations. Like, okay, Jamie, I've got some celebrations. So what's been going on in their mind from the last time I met to this time is they know I'm going to ask them. And so their brain is already like, okay, I'm going to store this celebration, I'm going to store this celebration, I'm going to store this celebration. So think what happens is kind of like your journaling, where every day you're saying, what are you grateful for? I'm training him to do it. I'm not asking him to journal, but it's the same concept. And it fundamentally changes how the brain works.
That was something that happened pretty quickly when I was doing this exercise. Is I would start to just in any given day go through the day and be like, okay, what am I going to put for being grateful, and then what am I going to put for highlights of my day? And you just start to recognize these little things. Because at the beginning it was really hard for me, but I went with the easy ones. For me it was, for example, my parents, things that are kind of easy, and then after a while you kind of just get conditioned to just appreciate and recognize things more.
Yeah. I don't drive a car. I recently bought one for, some personal reasons, but for years and years I went without a car. And one reason is I like to walk everywhere. So every day I get up, I walk to my office, I walk to the post office, I walk to get lunch, I walk home. But one of the reasons I do that is because so I can appreciate like life in slow motion. I can see the trees, I can see the birds, I can see the pebbles, I can see the pavement. I get to walk on pavement. Oh, I get to walk on a sidewalk. Oh, I get to see, oh, the snow is falling. Oh, the rain is falling. Oh, that whatever's happening. But it makes me remember. So this is, I'm coming back to the higher self here, is that when I walk, I remember that I get to be here and I get to live this experience. And I'm grateful for that. So as I'm walking along, my thoughts could be busy, busy, busy on stories or whatever. But what I work on is instead of that, I'm like, oh, like let's notice what there is here to be grateful for, or that we get to experience. And then that calms my thoughts, and it brings me back to remembering that I'm here having this beautiful earthly experience.
I think too that once you start getting the practice at it, and your brain gets accustomed to doing it, then it gets a lot easier with what I think the long-term goal of this is to be grateful for everything.
Mm-hmm. Everything. And the things that are the hardest, those are the things now that I'm the most grateful for. There everything that is happening in our lives, there's something to be grateful for in them. It might be hard for people who are listening to see that, but you're playing a long game. And if everything was easy, that's not much of a journey here, because the things that make me who I am are the hard things, the things that I thought I couldn't even imagine I could get through, and I did.
Well, and for me too, I mean, it started as small things, but it really, and it's not easy. It's really not easy in the moment, but looking back, I mean, that's something that's completely different for me. Rather than why this happened to me or going into this victim thing, you actually are able to kind of transform that into something you're grateful for, because it honestly, when you start with the little amounts of gratitude and you start just realizing the little things, it kind of just builds this snowball where you can kind of look back, and a lot of the things that were painful or difficult or hard or you had resentments towards, they really start to become these things that you're grateful for because they made you who you are. They're the reason you're here now. It's really powerful.
Very powerful. And to get to that place is very powerful.
And it's I mean, I think the easiest thing with gratitude is it's one of the easiest if you just start with the simple things and then train your brain to do it.
Yeah, I agree. Well, we have one more. Do we want to move on to the next one?
Yeah, so the sixth one is overall patience.
Yes, and being patient with yourself. I went to a training once years ago, And this the speaker talked about, he was in India and there was this wise woman, and like a kind of like a medicine woman, and he wanted to go meet her, and it took him like hours and hours and hours to get to her through the traffic, and it was just difficult, and he had all these problems, and he finally gets to this little lady's house, this old lady's house, and he said, you know, I've come to seek your wisdom. And he said, what, he asked her, what do you think is the most valuable attribute? And she said, patience. And that's all he traveled like 8 hours to get to her, and the only thing she had to say to him was patience. And I agree with that. Like, patience is very powerful. I've thought about that story a lot because I'm like, isn't that powerful? Isn't that important? But it really is. You know, we're not designed, Ruger, we're not designed to just push an easy button. We're not designed to have magic wands that make things happen instantly. We're just not designed that way. We're designed to take a step, take another step, take another step. Oh, now we're in the mud, blah, and mud again, blah. Now the steps might be a little easier. And then when after we've taken steps and steps and steps, and it's been months, and we look back and we can say, oh my gosh, like I've really done some good work here. But as we're in the mud and the muck and taking these steps that don't seem to be moving very fast, it's really easy to think, oh, you know, nothing's happening. But a lot is happening if we can just be patient with ourselves and trust as we take a step and another step that we're going to get there. We're going to get there. But the other thing I want to say about this too is, when I know people want to make things happen fast, but
I'm one of those people.
you one of those people? Well, we tease Ruger sometimes about like, oh, he, you know, in the retreat we say we're just looking for a 3% shift because over time it's huge. And Ruger's like, no, I got more than a 3% shift. But he did, you know, right when you started doing plant medicine, you did a huge shift. So maybe you went like this, but that was still like a couple of years ago. You were different than you were a month ago, 2 months ago, 3 months ago. You're not who you were 2 years ago. It doesn't like you went like with your shift, right? You did get a big shift, but you still, with that shift over time, it's becoming quite huge. Don't you think?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I still struggle with patience.
I think most of us struggle with patience.
But I think one thing that helps me with patience is having some amount of measurement with what you'd like to accomplish. And an example that I use is just, for me, sometimes it can be all or nothing. It's like, you know, I'll like, in the past I've decided, okay, like I'm gonna start going to the gym, and then it'll be I start trying to do it like 5 days a week, and then I get frustrated with myself because that's not even really realistic. And so something that I would recommend to people is that, like, if you want to do something, for example, journaling, a good technique to start with is just to commit to something that is simple, is, for example, 2 to 5 minutes a day. I'm going to do this for 2 minutes a day. And it kind of creates that bit of habit. It's achievable. And also, if you miss, even if you miss a 2 minute period, then still be patient with yourself.
Yeah, because tomorrow you can do it again. It's really more about resiliency, I think. About, you know, I can do it 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes. I miss a day. Okay, no big deal. Go back again, do it again, 2 minutes, 2 minutes. You know, a lot of times when we try to white knuckle something, it's like, okay, I'm going to be at the gym 3 hours a day, 5 days a week. I'm never going to miss. And that really is too much too fast, and it can freak our body out. It can freak our mind out. Remember, like, your ego wants to protect yourself, and it doesn't feel safe. And so all these, you can get lots of resistance. It takes a long time to undo it. But if you're like, okay, we're just gonna go to the gym 3 days a week for 20 minutes, and then maybe we'll change. But if we start slow, we have a better chance of not doing some, what I think of as a psychic damage. Like, we've created resistance. It's really hard to get rid of. I see it a lot in with when people do diets, really strict diets, and then they're yo-yo in their weight because they just went too far too fast. And that's not really our work, is like our gym or diets. Our work is really more in awareness and consciousness. But if you think about it this way, if you changed really fast. Your personality changed really fast. Your habits changed. Your belief systems changed really fast. You go to an ayahuasca retreat, you come back, you're a totally different person. It's not good. Like your body needs time to adjust and to change. And then the fabric of your life needs time to adjust and to change too. If you're married, if you have an intimate partner, if you have children, friends, community, your pets. I mean, we we change slowly for a reason because everything around us needs to ripple out and get adjusted to that change too. So just slow and steady. Be patient, slow and steady, and you're playing a long game. You've got decades to get this, to play any game you want to play in this world. Whatever one you decide.
I also feel that the patience does kind of tie back to the higher self, because I think your higher self, you're gonna get there. Your higher self's gonna get you there
Mhm.
eventually.
Mhm.
It's just kind of your own resistance to it. And but if you can kind of remember this, a lot of these concepts we talked about of just this higher self and really this patience is just, if you can really realize that we're just humans living this experience based on the information we have and based on our experiences, I think it's easier to kind of develop patience for yourself and for other people.
Yeah, because everybody else also is just living this experience based off the information that they have. And every human being is living a different experience. And so when you start remembering that, all these experiences are like my experiences are adding to your experiences, your experience are adding to Umberto's experiences. I mean, we're just all kind of pulsing within each person's experiences. But there's a lot going on if you think of all these people around us and they're all growing and they're all changing. We're just having this human experience, but it takes a while for that to happen because one person's fabric affects another person's, and so we're just not designed to change super fast. But over time, it's amazing what we can do.
Okay, so to summarize, is we have this version of our higher selves, we have this version of our narrative selves, and so a lot of these six techniques we talked about during this video really are to train your brain and to train your behavior in order to recognize the narrative self and then connect with the higher self.
Yeah, yeah.
If you're interested in experiencing any more of these topics firsthand through ayahuasca, reach out, let me know. If you're interested in attending a retreat at some point, I'll put the information in the link below.